Hi, welcome to the Rittner Floral School in Boston, Mass. I'm Dr. Steve Rittner, and it's a pleasure to welcome you into one of our classrooms today. We've got a really fun demonstration planned for you. I think you guys are really going to enjoy it. The topic of this one, I think you're going to find kind of interesting. What to do with the boughs after you finish working with them in doing some of your holiday designing. What do I mean by that? Well, typically, when you do a lot of your holiday and Christmas designing, we typically take some of our boughs of balsam and fir and things like this, and we trim them down. I mean, this is how it comes originally. When we buy these things, we buy bales of these kinds of greens. They're beautiful, and we generally take them and we start trimming them. And then we use the smaller pieces in all kinds of holiday floral art. But what happens to this? Well, we start off with something that looks big and proud like this. Then, after we start chopping pieces off, well, we end up with something like this, right? Because we're going to gradually take pieces and we're going to cut a piece off or cut another piece off like this. And then we'll use some of these pieces in other things. But look what happens to the original branch that we have. It gradually gets depleted. And then after we use it for a while and take all of these pieces off, then we eventually end up with something like this. It looks kind of decrepit, doesn't it? And what do we generally do with it? Well, at that point, we take these things and we throw them out, and that's that. But I would suggest that maybe we should look at these things a little bit differently. Instead of using this as an endpoint, perhaps we should start thinking in terms of creative ways where we can take some of the boughs after we've trimmed them to use a lot of the foliage and other things. Why not take the boughs and do something interesting with them? That's right. Come up with something creative using the end point and give it even more life and use it that way. And it's very, very easy to do it. For example, what we can do is we can take some of these end boughs, and here's an example. We can take some of the end boughs and then tie them together and then use them in floral designing. In other words, these are the boughs that were originally big and had all kinds of things coming up. We've trimmed them down, but instead of throwing them out, let's use it in floral art. In this demonstration, we're going to show you a couple of examples of this. Now, this is an example of 2 or 3 of these boughs that I've tied together. You don't think this could come up with something interesting in floral designing? Let me show you an example. Here is one that I just made up that I thought you guys would find of interest. We're using a very, very pretty silver container here. Notice that we have not 1 but 2. There's one section here and one section here. 2 of what I call the end boughs. In other words, they're the boughs that we've already taken and we've trimmed off, and we placed one over here, we placed one over here. And then, at that point, adding a few other things. Some carnations coming around like this in holiday colors. Some of our roses, working a little kind of pattern with roses over here. And then using some of the great winter berries from blooming of Beloit, Wisconsin, working them in here to come up with an end effect. It gives a very, very interesting effect, I think, and it's a creative way by which we can take something that would have normally been considered waste and normally been discarded and give it a new lease on life and come up with a design that has a very, very creative feel to it. We're always looking for interesting ideas and things that give our designing new looks and interesting approaches. And this is an easy one, and it's taking stuff that otherwise would have been considered waste and turning it into something that actually is very, very pretty and very creative. Let's actually do one, okay? I mean, this is one that's kind of an endpoint, but I think it's worthwhile to actually make one, and you can see how this comes together. Now, this is a matching piece. You saw the piece that we used a second ago, the container that was kind of a boat shape. We're going to do the exact same thing here. Once again, I'm going to start using some of my boughs, and here is a section that I've taken, I've grabbed, I've tied it together, and let's just give this a good thrust into our base. And notice, just with this alone, this is going to give an interesting effect. Just on that alone, it gives a very, very interesting kind of feel. Now, we can take some of our other materials, and I'm going to make a matching piece to the one that we just did, and I'm going to use the exact same materials. I'm going to take, for example, some carnations, and I'm going to place a carnation here, place a second one in, and notice I am deliberately, my viewer, using a material that we normally consider to be a kind of an everyday kind of material. Carnations often get a bad rap because they're often considered to be everyday and mundane. And so I am deliberately using carnations in this demonstration so that you can see how you can take even the most common everyday materials and then using them in this way come up with an interesting effect. So I'm taking my carnations, and notice I've created a line using my carnations. Now let's take some of our roses, because after all, the rose is one of the most popular flowers there are. It's a pretty flower. It's one that is a prestige flower. People love them, and they give a very, very nice effect. And I'm going to take a few of my roses, and I'm going to work some roses into this, my viewer. And you can see that I am taking just a few things and coming up with a very, very interesting effect, making use of some of these materials. But look at how it works so nicely with my bough that I happen to have in the background here. And then I'm taking these other things, working them in, and coming up with an interesting effect, working them through. I'm going to take another rose, and I'm going to cut it down and place it over here, in here towards the center. In other words, I'm playing with my different materials and coming up with a really, really cool effect using some of these things. In other words, you can sometimes find materials and sources and ideas in places that you may never have really expected them to come from, and come up with some very, very interesting interpretations. So I'm taking some of my roses and I'm gradually working it into my piece, placing them here and there to create a line within a line on this, making use of that. Now I could stop at this point, but wait, there's more. We used some of the winter berries in the last design, so I'm going to do the same thing here. I'm going to take some of my winter berries and I'm going to incorporate them. It adds an interesting level of visual complexity to my design, some added interest. And I think it adds a lot, and it makes it feel more visually complex. And I'm going to take some of the winter berries and I'm working them in here and there, placing them in between my original boughs of foliage and my carnations and roses. So I'm working a little here and there into it. You can see, my viewer, it's becoming a little bit more visually interesting, a little more visually complex by working this in. I'm going to work another piece over here on this side, and then I'm going to bring another piece of my winterberry over here. So now we have something that is visually even more complicated because we've added this added level of our winterberry here. What do you think? Interesting, isn't it? Now we always have to cover our mechanics on our designs. We don't just leave our foam show. And so I'm going to take some of my moss material and I'm going to cover my mechanics using some of my moss, and I'm using small hairpins. A hairpin is a small piece of bent wire that we can take and use it to secure our moss in place. And so I'm very, very carefully working the moss in between in terms of my materials here, so that in that way it's secured in place. And I'm going to continue the process, adding another piece over on the side here, and then obviously I would continue the whole process putting it into the sides as well as the back. But I think you can see the way this thing has proceeded. Quick, easy, and yet visually very, very interesting. And that's the whole idea. At Rittner's Floral School, we believe very strongly that floral designing should be quick, easy, and fun. And I think you can see how in this particular case, we've taken materials that normally would have been considered discards, something like branchy material that was left over after we did our cuttings, and then by taking it, by gathering it together, tying it together, and then working it in through as an infrastructure on our design, we can come up with some very, very cool things. Now these two designs stand very nicely on their own, but I could see using these two arrangements in different places. Perhaps you want to have something in a bay window of your home, perhaps another one on the fireplace, or perhaps in an entry area. But the concept is that we have unified pieces using similar containers, using similar materials, and we're making use of our end boughs to come up with a really, really cool effect in terms of our floral art. Well, my viewer, we've covered a lot in a short period of time. I hope you found that this stimulates your thinking. And now when you take some of those boughs and you break them down and use some of the smaller pieces and more conventional designing, you think in terms of, okay, what can I do with some of these branches that are the leftovers to come up with some very, very interesting, unusual, funky, and kinky type floral art for the holiday season. On behalf of all of us here at Rittner's Floral School, I'm Dr. Steve Rittner. We thank you for coming in and visiting with us today.